that plague us today are in large part consequences of that narrative's success. By turning to history from a multidisciplinary perspective, we can construct a more balanced narrative and sketch the outlines of a new participatory socialism for the 21st century. By this, I mean a new universalistic egalitarian narrative, a new ideology of equality, social ownership, education, and knowledge and power sharing. This new narrative presents a more optimistic picture of human nature than did its predecessors, and not only more optimistic, but also more precise and convincing because it is more firmly rooted in the lessons of global history. Of course, it is up to each of us to judge the merits of these tentative and provisional lessons, to rework them as necessary, and to carry them forward. What is an ideology? Before I explain how this book is organized, I want to discuss the principal sources on which I rely and how the present work relates to capital in the 21st century. But first, I need to say a few words about the notion of ideology as I use it in this study. I use ideology in a positive and constructive sense to refer to a set of a priori plausible ideas and discourses describing how society should be structured. An ideology has social, economic, and political dimensions. It is an attempt to respond to a broad set of questions concerning the desirable or ideal organization of society. Given the complexity of the issues, it should be obvious that no ideology can ever command full and total assent. Ideological conflict and disagreement are inherent in the very notion of ideology. Nevertheless, every society must attempt to answer questions about how it should be organized, usually on the basis of its own historical experience, but sometimes also on the experiences of other societies. Individuals will usually also feel called on to form opinions of their own on these fundamental existential issues, however vague or unsatisfactory they may be. What are these fundamental issues? One is the question of what the nature of the political regime should be. By political regime, I mean the set of rules describing the boundaries of the community and its territory, the mechanisms of collective decision-making, and the political rights of members. These rules govern forms of political participation and specify the respective roles of citizens and foreigners, as well as the functions of executives and legislators, ministers and kings, parties and elections, empires and colonies. Another fundamental issue has to do with the property regime, by which I mean the set of rules describing the different possible forms of ownership, as well as the legal and practical procedures for regulating property relations between different social groups. Such rules may pertain to private or public property, real estate, financial assets, land or mineral resources, slaves or serfs, intellectual and other immaterial forms of property, and relations between landlords and tenants, nobles and peasants, masters and slaves, or shareholders and wage earners. Every society, every inequality regime is characterized by a set of more or less coherent and persistent answers to these questions about its political and property regimes. These two sets of answers are often closely related because they depend in large part on some theory of inequality between different social groups, whether real or imagined, legitimate or illegitimate. The answers generally imply a range of other intellectual and institutional commitments. For instance, commitments to an educational regime, that is, the rules governing institutions and organizations responsible for transmitting spiritual values, knowledge, and ideas, including families, churches, parents, and schools and universities, and a tax regime, that is, arrangements for providing states or regions, towns or empires, and social, religious, or other collective organizations with adequate resources. The answers to these questions can vary widely. People can agree about the political regime but not the property regime, or about certain fiscal or educational arrangements but not others. Ideological conflict is almost always multidimensional, even if one axis takes priority for a time, giving the illusion of majoritarian consensus, allowing broad collective mobilization and historical transformations of great magnitude. Borders and property. To simplify, we can say that every inequality regime, every inegalitarian ideology, rests on both a theory of borders and a theory of property. The border question is of primary importance. Every society must explain who belongs to the human political community it comprises and who does not, what territory it governs under what institutions, and how it will organize its relations with other communities within the universal human community, which, depending on the ideology involved, may or may not be explicitly acknowledged. The border question and the political regime question are, of course, closely linked. The answer to the border question also has significant implications for social inequality, especially between citizens and non-citizens. The property question must also be answered. What is a person allowed to own? Can one person own others? Can he or she own land, buildings, firms, natural resources, knowledge, financial assets, and public debt? What practical guidelines and laws should govern relations between owners of property and non-owners? How should ownership be transmitted across generations? Along with the educational and fiscal regime, the property regime determines the structure and evolution of social inequality. In most pre-modern societies, the questions of the political regime and the property regime are intimately related. In other words, power over individuals and power over things are not independent. Here, things refers to possessed objects, which may be persons in the case of slavery. Furthermore, power over things may imply power over persons. This is obviously true in slave societies, where the two questions essentially merge into one. Some individuals own others, and therefore also rule over them. The same is true, but in more subtle fashion, in what I call ternary or trifunctional societies. That is, societies divided into three functional classes: a clerical and religious class, a noble and warrior class, and a common and laboring class. In this historical form, which we find in most pre-modern civilizations, the two dominant classes are both ruling classes, in the senses of exercising the regalian powers of security and justice, and property-owning classes. For centuries, the landlord was also the ruler, seigneur, of the people who lived and worked on his land, just as much as he was the seigneur, lord of the land itself. By contrast, ownership, or proprietarian societies of the sort that flourished in Europe in the 19th century, drew a sharp distinction between the property question, with universal property rights theoretically open to all, and the power question, with the centralized state claiming a monopoly of regalian rights. The political regime and the property regime were nevertheless closely related, in part because political rights were long restricted to property owners, and in part because constitutional restrictions then and now severely limited the possibility for political majorities to modify the property regime by legal and peaceful means. As we shall see, political and property regimes have remained inextricably intertwined from pre-modern ternary and slave societies to modern post-colonial and hyper-capitalist ones, including along the way the communist and social democratic societies that arose in reaction to the crises of inequality and identity that ownership society provoked. To analyze these historical transformations, I therefore rely on the notion of an inequality regime, which encompasses both the political regime and the property regime, as well as the educational and fiscal regimes, and clarifies the relation between them. To illustrate the persistent structural links between the political regime and the property regime in today's world, consider the absence of any democratic mechanism that would allow a majority of citizens of the European Union, and a fortiori citizens of the world, to adopt a common tax or a redistributive or developmental scheme. This is because each member state, no matter how small its population or what benefits it derives from commercial and financial integration, has the right to veto all forms of fiscal legislation. More generally, inequality today is strongly influenced by the system of borders and national sovereignty, which determines the allocation of social and political rights. This has given rise to intractable multidimensional ideological conflicts over inequality, immigration, and national identity. Conflicts that have made it very difficult to achieve majority coalitions capable of countering the rise of inequality. Specifically, ethno-religious and national cleavages often prevent people of different ethnic and national origins from coming together politically, thus strengthening the hand of the rich and contributing to the growth of inequality. The reason for this failure is the lack of an ideology capable of persuading disadvantaged social groups that what unites them is more important than what divides them. I will examine these issues in due course. Here I want simply to emphasize the fact that political and property regimes have been intimately related for a very long time. This durable structural relationship cannot be properly analyzed without adopting a long-run transnational historical perspective. Taking ideology seriously. Inequality is neither economic nor technological. It is ideological and political. This is no doubt the most striking conclusion to emerge from the historical approach I take in this book. In other words, the market and competition, profits and wages, capital and debt, skilled and unskilled workers, natives and aliens, tax havens and competitiveness, none of these things exist as such. All are social and historical constructs, which depend entirely on the legal, fiscal, educational, and political systems that people choose to adopt and the conceptual definitions they choose to work with. These choices are shaped by each society's conception of social justice and economic fairness, and by the relative political and ideological power of contending groups and discourses. Importantly, this relative power is not exclusively material. It is also intellectual and ideological. In other words, ideas and ideologies count in history. They enable us to imagine new worlds and different types of society. Many paths are possible. This approach runs counter to the common conservative argument that inequality has a basis in nature. It is hardly surprising that the elites of many societies in all periods and climes have sought to naturalize inequality. They argue that existing social disparities benefit not only the poor, but also society as a whole, and that any attempt to alter the existing order of things will cause great pain. History proves the opposite. Inequality varies widely in time and space, in structure as well as magnitude. Changes have occurred rapidly in ways that contemporaries could not have imagined only a short while before they came about. Misfortune did sometimes follow. Broadly speaking, however, political processes, including revolutionary transformations, that led to a reduction of inequality proved to be immensely successful. From them came our most precious institutions, those that have made human progress a reality, including universal suffrage, free and compulsory public schools, universal health insurance, and progressive taxation. In all likelihood, the future will be no different. The inequalities and institutions that exist today are not the only ones possible, whatever conservatives may say to the contrary. Change is permanent and inevitable. Nevertheless, the approach taken in this book, based on ideologies, institutions, and the possibility of alternative pathways, also differs from approaches sometimes characterized as Marxist, according to which the state of the economic forces and relations of production determines a society's ideological superstructure in an almost mechanical fashion. In contrast, I insist that the realm of ideas, the political ideological sphere, is truly autonomous. Given an economy and a set of productive forces in a certain state of development, supposing one can attach a definite meaning to those words, which is by no means certain, a range of possible ideological, political, and inequality regimes always exists. For instance, the theory that holds that a transition from feudalism to capitalism occurred as a more or less mechanical response to the Industrial Revolution cannot explain the complexity and multiplicity of the political and ideological pathways we actually observe in different countries and regions. In particular, it fails to explain the differences that exist between and within colonizing and colonized regions. Above all, it fails to impart lessons useful for understanding subsequent stages of history. When we look closely at what followed, we find that alternatives always existed and always will. At every level of development, economic, social, and political systems can be structured in many different ways. Property relations can be organized differently, different fiscal and educational regimes are possible, problems of public and private debt can be handled differently, numerous ways to manage relations between human communities exist, and so on. There are always several ways of organizing a society and its constitutive power and property relations. More specifically, today, in the 21st century, property relations can be organized in many ways. Clearly stating the alternatives may be more useful in transcending capitalism than simply threatening to destroy it without explaining what comes next. The study of these different historical pathways, as well as of the many paths not taken, is the best antidote to both the conservatism of the elite and the alibis of would-be revolutionaries who argue that nothing can be done until the conditions for revolution are ripe. The problem with these alibis is that they indefinitely defer all thinking about the post-revolutionary future. What this usually means in practice is that all power is granted to a hypertrophied state, which may turn out to be just as dangerous as the quasi-sacred property relations that the revolution sought to overthrow. In the 20th century, such thinking did considerable human and political damage for which we are still paying the price. Today, the post-communist societies of Russia, China, and to a certain extent Eastern Europe, despite their different historical trajectories, have become hyper-capitalism's staunchest allies. This is a direct consequence of the disasters of Stalinism and Maoism, and the consequent rejection of all egalitarian internationalist ambitions. So great was the communist disaster that it overshadowed even the damage done by the ideologies of slavery, colonialism, and racialism, and obscured the strong ties between those ideologies and the ideologies of ownership and hypercapitalism. No mean feat. In this book, I take ideology very seriously. I try to reconstruct the internal coherence of different types of ideology, with special emphasis on 6 main categories which I will call proprietarian, social democratic, communist, trifunctional, slavist, esclavagiste, and colonialist ideologies. I start with the hypothesis that every ideology, no matter how extreme it may seem in its defense of inequality, expresses a certain idea of social justice. There is always some plausible basis for this idea, some sincere and consistent foundation from which it is possible to draw useful lessons. But we cannot do this unless we take a concrete rather than an abstract, which is to say ahistorical and non-institutional approach to the study of political and ideological structures. We must look at concrete societies and specific historical periods, and at specific institutions defined by specific forms of property and specific fiscal and educational regimes. These must be rigorously analyzed. We must not shrink from investigating legal systems, tax schedules, and educational resources, the conditions and rules under which societies function. Without these, institutions and ideologies are mere empty shells, incapable of affecting real social change or inspiring lasting allegiance. I am of course well aware that the word ideology can be used pejoratively, sometimes with good reason. Dogmatic ideas divorced from facts are frequently characterized as ideological. Yet often it is those who claim to be purely pragmatic who are in fact most ideological in the pejorative sense. Their claim to be post-ideological barely conceals their disdain for evidence, historical ignorance, distorting biases, and class interests. This book will therefore lean heavily on facts. I will discuss the history of inequality in several societies, partly because this was my original specialty, and partly because I am convinced that unbiased examination of the available sources is the only way to make progress. In so doing, I will compare societies which are very different from one another. Some are even said to be exceptional and therefore unsuitable for comparative study, but this is incorrect. I am well placed to know, however, that the available sources are never sufficient to resolve every dispute. From facts alone, we will never be able to deduce the ideal political regime or property regime or fiscal or educational regime. Why? Because facts are largely the products of institutions, such as censuses, surveys, tax records, and so on. Societies create social, fiscal, and legal categories to describe, measure, and transform themselves. Hence, facts are themselves constructs. To appreciate them properly, we must understand their context, which consists of complex, overlapping, self-interested interactions between the observational apparatus and the society under study. This, of course, does not mean that these cognitive constructs have nothing to teach us. It means rather that to learn from them, we must take this complexity and reflexivity into account. Furthermore, the questions that interest us, which pertain to the nature of the ideal social, economic, and political organization, are far too complex to allow answers to emerge from a simple objective examination of the facts, which inevitably reflect the limitations of past experiences and the incompleteness of our knowledge and of the deliberative processes to which we were exposed. Finally, it is entirely conceivable that the ideal regime, however we interpret the word ideal, is not unique and depends on specific characteristics of each society. Collective learning and the social sciences. Nevertheless, my position is not one of indiscriminate relativism. It is too easy for the social scientist to avoid taking a stand, so I will eventually make my position clear, especially in the final part of the book, but in so doing I will attempt to explain how and why I reached my conclusions. Social ideologies usually evolve in response to historical experience. For instance, the French Revolution stemmed in part from the injustices and frustrations of the Ancien Régime. The revolution, in turn, brought about changes that permanently altered perceptions of the ideal inequality regime as various social groups judged the success or failure of revolutionary experiments with different forms of political organization, property regimes, and social, fiscal, and educational systems. What was learned from this experience inevitably influenced future political transformations, and so on down the line. Each nation's political and ideological trajectory can be seen as a vast process of collective learning and historical experimentation. Conflict is inherent in the process because different social and political groups have not only different interests and aspirations, but also different memories. Hence, they interpret past events differently and draw from them different implications regarding the future. From such learning experiences, national consensus on certain points can nevertheless emerge, at least for a time. Though partly rational, these collective learning processes nevertheless have their limits. Nations tend to have short memories. People often forget their own country's experiences after a few decades, or else remember only scattered bits, seldom chosen at random. Worse than that, memory is usually strictly nationalistic. Perhaps that is putting it too strongly. Every country occasionally learns from the experiences of other countries, whether indirectly or through direct contact, in the form of war, colonization, occupation, or treaty, forms of learning that may be neither welcome nor beneficial. For the most part, however, nations form their visions of the ideal political or property regime, or just legal, fiscal, or educational system from their own experiences, and are almost completely unaware of the experiences of other countries, particularly when they are geographically remote or thought to belong to a distinct civilization or religious or moral tradition, or again when contact with the other has been violent, which can reinforce the sense of radical foreignness. More generally, collective learning experiences are often based on relatively crude or imprecise notions of the institutional arrangements that exist in other societies, or even within the same country or in neighboring countries. This is true not only in the political realm, but also in regard to legal, fiscal, and educational institutions. The usefulness of the lessons derived from such collective learning experiences is therefore somewhat limited. This limitation is not inevitable, however. Many factors can enhance the learning process: schools and books, immigration and intermarriage, parties and trade unions, travel and encounters, newspapers and other media, to name a few. The social sciences can also play a part. I am convinced that social scientists can contribute to the understanding of ongoing changes by carefully comparing the histories of countries with different cultural traditions, systematically exploiting all available resources, and studying the evolution of inequality and of political and ideological regimes in different parts of the world. Such a comparative, historical, transnational approach can help us to form a more accurate picture of what a better political, economic, and social organization might look like, and especially what a better global society might look like, since the global community is the one political community to which we all belong. Of course, I do not claim that the conclusions I offer throughout the book are the only ones possible, but they are, in my view, the best conclusions we can draw from the sources I have explored. I will try to explain in detail which events and comparisons I found most persuasive in reaching these conclusions. I will not hide the uncertainties that remain. Obviously, however, these conclusions depend on the very limited state of our present knowledge. This book is but one small step in a vast process of collective learning. I am impatient to discover what the next steps in the human adventure will be. I hasten to add, for the benefit of those who lament the rise of inequality and of identity politics, as well as for those who think that I protest too much, that this book is in no way a book of lamentations. I am an optimist by nature, and my primary goal is to seek solutions to our common problems. Human beings have demonstrated an astonishing capacity to imagine new institutions and develop new forms of cooperation, to forge bonds among millions, or hundreds of millions, or even billions of people who have never met and will never meet, and who might well choose to annihilate one another rather than live together in peace. This is admirable. What is more, societies can accomplish these feats even though we know little about what an ideal regime might look like, and therefore about what rules are justifiable. Nevertheless, our ability to imagine new institutions has its limits. We therefore need the assistance of rational analysis. To say that inequality is ideological and political rather than economic or technological does not mean that it can be eliminated by a wave of some magic wand. It means, more modestly, that we must take seriously the ideological and institutional diversity of human society. We must beware of anyone who tries to naturalize inequality or deny the existence of alternative forms of social organization. It means, too, that we must carefully study in detail the institutional arrangements and legal, fiscal, and educational systems of other countries, for it is these details that determine whether cooperation succeeds or fails, and whether equality increases or decreases. Goodwill is not enough without solid conceptual and institutional underpinnings. If I can communicate to you, the listener, a little of my educated amazement at the successes of the past and persuade you that knowledge of history and economics